Okay. Yep, it's on. Yep.
I'm delighted that so many of you have turned out this evening for the talk on fungi. As I was going back through the records of the science group previous years, I realized that while we'd had lots of talks on biology, they'd been concerned with plants and they'd been concerned with fauna. And of course, fungi is its own kingdom in the biological order. So it's extraordinary that this is the first talk on fungi that we've had in those years. But what the science group has missed out in terms of quantity, we always make up for in terms of quality. So this evening, we've got Lee Davies, I should immediately say no relation, who's curator of fungi at Kew Gardens, to talk about the various parts of the relationship between fungi and humans over the years. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Applause at the beginning is always a good sign because it makes me feel good about it. If there's no applause at the end, I start to get worried. Okay, so yes, as I've been very kindly introduced, my name's Lee. I'm now the collection manager. I got promoted, I think, since I possibly spoke to Jim. So I basically run and look after Kew's Fungarium collection. And Kew has what is the biggest scientific collection of fungi in the world. We have about 1.3 million specimens, about 150 years worth of collections from every country on Earth, and a very broad taxonomic range in terms of what we have in our collection. So it's also the best collection in the world. For that reason, I am very biased, but it is objectively, I can promise you. So I was under the impression, I was told that you haven't had a fungi talk before, so I thought I'd keep this quite broad and try and talk about lots of different things. I was under semi-strict instructions to talk about, I don't know how to describe this, Class A drugs. So I am going to mention magic mushrooms, and it's not at all glorifying their use because I said they are Class A drugs. They're far more interesting as well for that reason. So I figured the first thing we would do is we will start talking about what are fungi, what makes a fungus a fungus. Fungi come in all shapes and sizes. There are those that are familiar, things like these sort of mushroomy mushrooms. There are some quite different looking things. We have like puffballs, earth stars, some quite animalian or humanoid, if anyone here is an anatomist, they might recognize something like this. They come in all shapes and sizes, from the familiar to the very, very odd and the very, very unusual. And we have to include in this, of course, things like lichens. Normally, lichens get overlooked. They tend to be thought of as plants because they are largely photosynthetic, but they are a fungus. They're a strange fungus that lives in a symbiotic relationship with a number of different organisms. And of course, we have billions and billions of fungi out there that are microscopic and live as single cells in the oceans or in the soil. So it's a huge kingdom, an extremely diverse kingdom. And we think that there's probably 95% of fungal species are yet to be discovered. We've scientifically described 144,000 species, and there are probably between 2 and 5 million yet to do. So in terms of a career, I'm sorted for life. Plenty to keep me busy. My botanist colleagues, on the other hand, their days are numbered because about 95% of plants have been done. So they've got, maybe a decade or two. We've got generations left of fungal work to do. So these are the familiar parts of the fungus. This is the fruiting body. And these are the parts that pop up every autumn and are the bits that we recognize and we see. It's the only part that we really recognize and see. And the purpose of this is reproduction. These are, to put it crudely, the genitalia of the fungus. And the fungus itself is usually underground, or it's hidden. And what makes them unique, and what makes a fungus as opposed to being a plant or an animal, there are a number of characteristics. First of all, they're heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. They have to get the food from the environment around them. So they're the same as animals in that respect. And fungi do this in a variety of different ways. Sometimes they do that by just eating the environment around them and digesting it. Alternatively, they set up partnerships with other organisms and they support each other, a bit like those lichens do. So fungi, they're heterotrophs. The second thing, and what sets. So this is chitin. This is a big complex biopolymer. And fungi use this to make their cell wall. So cell walls, animals don't have one. We have a cell membrane. Fungi have a cell wall made of chitin. Plants also have a cell wall, but it's made of cellulose. So this is the thing that's truly unique to the kingdom of fungi, and it's what makes them distinct from plants and from animals. This collection here isn't a mistake. Chitin you may have come across before. It's the same material that arthropods make their exoskeletons from. So if you crush a beetle, the reason it goes crunch is because that exoskeleton is made of this tough chitin. It's the same material also that things like squids and octopuses make their beak from. It's tough biopolymer common to fungi and to animals, which may indicate, oh, maybe they're closely related, and that is the case. You're more closely related to a mushroom than you are to any plant. In fact, we are cousins to fungi. And that's the next slide. This display on this shows me 2 slides. So these are the bits that we may be familiar with and the bits that we are not necessarily familiar with. So this is the mushroom. Not all fruiting bodies look like a mushroom. We have things that look like quite anatomical. We have little blobby things. The blobby ones are usually not very interesting. My colleagues won't like me saying that, but they are. And this is really what is the main body of the fungus. This is the mycelium, this big thread-like mass. And this is, to use the analogy of a plant, the mycelium is the equivalent of the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves of a tree. The mushroom is a bit like the flower or the fruit. So the mycelium is the bit that's doing all the work. This is eating and digesting and growing and fighting. This is the real organism, and it's the mycelium that then produces the mushroom that we're familiar with. And it's the mycelium that's hidden underground or inside a tree or inside a plant or an animal or something. And because they're this mass of thread-like structures, it means they have a slight problem when it comes to food. So as animals, we are quite lucky in the sense that we are basically a very complex tube. If we get food, we put it inside us and it's ours. We can digest it, nobody else can have it, it's secure. If you're a fungus and you're a mycelium, you don't have that luxury. The food that you want is outside of you. So if you're in some compost and you're digesting and rotting and breaking down all of the organic matter, all of those nutrients that you're releasing are available for other organisms to get to. So what you have to do is stop them competing with your food. And this means that fungi become really, really good at being biochemists and producing different compounds to enable them to protect the food that they're creating effectively. And that's really useful for human beings because we make use of those compounds. I'm going to come on to that later when we talk about more fun things. I'm going to stick to the general fungi stuff at the moment. So in our collection that we have, and most of the things that you might see out there in the world that are fungal, there are 2 big groups that we deal with. So we have the ascomycetes and the basidiomycetes. So the ascomycetes are generally the smaller, blobbier things. So they tend to be like little, like this one in the lower left here. This is a little Hymenoscypher. This is a little cup fungus. They're a couple of millimeters across. They're very, very tiny and very pretty. You also have lichens, which are almost always ascomycete fungi, and the only ascomycete fungi that look like a mushroom are things like morels. But generally speaking, they're very, very diverse. About 60% of fungi are ascomycetes, and they tend to be small and very, very difficult to identify because they're so small. And the big thing that sets these apart from other fungi is where their spores are produced. So they have a sex cell that's called an ascus, and inside of that are where the spores are created, and then that ascus cell bursts open and the spores drift off on the wind. Conversely, and alternatively, you have the basidiomycete fungi, so the mushroomy mushrooms, the things that are far more familiar and obvious because they're usually a lot bigger. So things like this death cap here on the far left. You have this really odd fungus in the middle, this thing called a pagoda fungus. It looks like a stack of mushrooms, one on top of the other. And then you have puffballs. And the big thing that sets these apart is that the sex cells are produced on the outside so the spores are produced on the outside of the sex cell. So they have a sex cell called a basidia, and the spores form on the end of it, and they drop off. So if you buy mushrooms from the supermarket and you look at the gills underneath the mushroom, the gill is the surface that these spores are produced on, and it's where those basidia grow and produce the spores to drop off. And that's the two big groups of fungi. I think about 30% of fungi are basidiomycetes. And these are what we have in our collection. These, we have 1.3 million either ascomycetes or basidiomycetes at Kew. And this is what most of our research at Kew is based on, these two big groups of what we tend to call macrofungi. The microfungi are single-celled, tiny little things. We don't have a huge amount of those because they're quite difficult to dry and study over decades and a century or two. Let me think. I think that's kind of as far as fungus goes, that's the broad introduction to what they are and how they do the things they do. This next thing, we're going to talk about the roles that fungi have. They have three big ecological roles in the world, and these are where it starts to get important for humans. So this is totally unrelated to anything, but it's a really cool picture. So this is a mask that's made out of a bracket fungus. So in Nepal and Tibet, they make these masks out of bracket fungi. The local traditional religious shamans, they produce these masks as a way of warding off evil. And they're amazing. I think this is from about the 19th century. I've been wanting to get one of these for years, and then luckily someone offered us one about 2 months ago, so we now have one of these in Kew. I have tried it on. It's very small for my face. It's fun. Okay, totally unrelated. So there are three big roles that fungi play in the environment and ecosystem around them. And it's worth saying that fungi are the foundation of any healthy ecosystem. Fungi do all the work. Everyone tends to think of plants as the ones that, the primary producers, the photosynthesizers, the basis of every food chain are the photosynthetic plants. It's rubbish. Fungi do all the work that allow the plants to exist and to live and to thrive. To begin with, you have the saprobes. Those are the decomposers. These are the fungi that are eating all dead organic matter out there in the environment. All the leaves that fall in autumn are broken down and eaten by fungi. They're the ones that are recycling all of that organic material to make it available for the plants to use, to grow, and to do their part as well. And they are the best ones out there. Fungi can eat everything. They are one of the few organisms that can eat wood, for instance. I think it was about 400 million years ago, wood evolved as a thing by plants. And within a few million years of wood appearing in the fossil record, you find fossils of woody plants that have been eaten and are in the process of being eaten by fungi. So fungi are the absolute best thing out there in the ecosystem for turning everything over and ensuring that nutrients are cycling through any kind of healthy ecosystem. The next big group, which is crucial to plants, these are fungi that live in a symbiotic relationship in some way, shape, or form. Lichens are one of those. You have a fungus that provides a home for a photosynthetic algae or a photosynthetic bacteria to live. The photosymbiont produces sugars for the fungus, and in return, the fungus gets water and nutrients and a safe place to live for the little photosymbiont. And it's a little community of probably 3 totally distinct organisms living together, sharing nutrients and supporting one another. best group of mycorrhizal fungi I'm going to come on to the best group of mutualists, sorry, are the mycorrhizal fungi. I'll come on to those in a moment, but these are vital for all plants on Earth. This is where you have a fungus and a plant will fuse together below the soil at the roots, and they will feed and support each other. And without one, the other can't exist. And these are what about 95% of all plants on Earth need to have in order to survive and to thrive. And in some cases, it's even more important, orchids. So orchids are a hugely diverse plant group. Loads of my colleagues like orchids. They're very odd, they're very beautiful. And all orchids need to have a mycorrhizal fungal partner in order to even germinate as seeds. No fungi, no orchids, and no plants as well. The third group of fungi, which don't seem like they're an important thing ecologically, are pathogens. So these are fungi which kill other living organisms, and that can be animals, and it can be plants, or it can be other fungi as well. So these are killing other organisms in a variety of fun and exciting ways. And for any kind of healthy ecosystem, you need to have pathogens. They make sure that no single species dominates. The healthiest rainforest ecosystems have a diverse array of pathogenic organisms. I'm going to come on to here. I should have done this earlier on and switched as I went along, but never mind. So going back onto the saprobic fungi, I'll briefly whiz through this one. So these, like I said, these are just eating stuff. So things like these bracket fungi, they eat trees. And they eat living trees as well. But surprisingly, that's actually really important for the living trees. They need to have their insides eaten out. We, in this country, are very proud of things like the big ancient oak trees that we have that live to be 1,000, 2,000 years old. To live that long, an oak tree needs to have its heartwood eaten out. So when an oak tree reaches a certain size, it has to undergo a process called veteranization, which means that the inside gets hollowed out, which makes it more resistant to being blown over by wind and by storms. By being hollow, it's much more flexible. It also becomes a really important habitat for other organisms, such as bats, invertebrates, all those kinds of things. So if you don't have one of these wood-rotting fungi eat out the middle of an oak tree, it won't live to be 1,000 years old. It might make a couple of hundred, because it will blow over because it's too rigid and strong. There's a big project in the UK at the moment to try and inoculate lots of youngish oak trees with these sorts of fungi, because we apparently have a big gap in our oak trees. We have lots and lots of young oak trees, and we have lots of old oak trees. And we have nothing in the middle, because we cut them all down to make ships about 130, 140 years ago. So we need to make a lot of these younger oak trees into veterans in order that they will survive. So they're really brilliant, and they eat wood. Okay, I'm going to go swiftly onto the mycorrhizal fungi, because this is bonkers. It's proper sci-fi type stuff. So I'll talk about the tree one. The tree ones are better because they tend to produce the mushrooms that you're more familiar with. So this cartoon illustration that's on here, it's got the roots of a tree. It's got some amanita fungi on the side there. And so roots. This is a picture done a microscope of the tips of some roots, and they look like they're covered in little fluffy socks or mittens. And that's fungal tissue. That's the mycelium forming little socks around the root tips. And what happens in the soil, particularly with trees, is that the fungus will get nutrients from the and it will feed those to the tree. It also feeds trees water. The fungal mycelium can be enormous. It can be like several meters across. It's got a massive surface area, which means it's really, really good for absorbing water. And so they're also feeding water to the trees as well. In exchange for doing this, the tree provides the fungus with sugars that it's producing through photosynthesis. And like I said, they have to have this relationship. If you have trees or plants without mycorrhizal fungi, they do not thrive. They do very, very poorly. It starts to become a little bit sci-fi, because you can have, in a forest, you can have 30 or 40 individual fungi associating with a single tree. And a single fungus can form a mycorrhizal relationships with multiple trees at the same time. So you have this underground network of fungus and tree all interacting, and you actually get exchange of nutrients between trees using a fungal network to do so. There were some cool experiments done up near by Birmingham University, I believe it was. And what they did was they took a forest and they put a tent around a single tree, and they pumped carbon dioxide, which had been had a higher carbon, I think it was carbon-13 isotope on it rather than the normal carbon-12 and 14. And they basically provided this one isolated tree with this radioisotope carbon dioxide, and what they found was that about 5% of that carbon ended up in neighbouring trees because the sugars produced by the by the tree were ending up in the fungus, and they were also diffusing into neighbouring trees that this fungus was also connected to. It wasn't an active process of them using this as a dispersant. It wasn't like the trees deliberately sharing nutrients. It was a byproduct of having this underground network of fungus and tree all interacting and what have you. It goes a step further and gets a bit stranger because you also have a kind of rudimentary communication between plants using the fungus as a network in order to transmit messages. Again, more cool experiments done up near Birmingham using broad beans. And what they did was they grew broad beans in a big tub, lots of them. They made sure that there was a mycorrhizal fungus in there so that the beans were connected up with this mycorrhizal fungus. And then they isolated a broad bean plant in the middle and put aphids on it. And if you're a broad bean plant and you're being attacked by aphids, you produce tannins to make yourself taste bad so that the aphids don't eat you. So this is a defense mechanism that broad beans do. And what they found was that the broad beans outside of the infection were also producing tannins as a defense mechanism, which seems strange to be doing when they're not under attack. And it's because the tannins were diffusing through the mycelium under the ground, were being detected by the other broad beans, who were then responding as if they were under attack. And so there was it's not communication in the sense that we deliberately talk to one another. It was more like the neighbouring plants eavesdropping on the distress calls of this infected and aphid-attacked broad bean in the middle. And we think this happens out in the wild as well. It kind of gets overdone in popular media that trees are talking to each other and feeding each other. It's not quite like that. It's a much more passive process, but it is a process that is happening, and we do have nutrients being spread throughout tree networks and communication between different plants using the mycorrhizal fungus as a medium to transmit those messages and those nutrients. Mycorrhizal are crucial to all plants on Earth. There are very few plants that don't rely on these symbiotic relationships. The third group are pathogens. So these are the fungi that are killing and eating living organisms. I'm not going to talk about fungal pathogens of plants because they're not that interesting. That's much more of the Royal Horticultural Society interest type thing. What I'm really interested in are fungi that attack insects. These are pathogenic fungi. These are, in this case, I think these are two different species, a thing called Ophiocordyceps. These get called zombie fungi in popular media because they have a really, really interesting and novel way of infecting and doing horrible things to their host. In the case of the tarantula, this is another infected tarantula in the Fungarium. This is the nice version of what happens with these entomopathogenic fungi. So that the fungus bores its way inside its host. It's able to do that really easily because, as I mentioned at the beginning, fungi have a chitinous cell wall, which means they can metabolize, they can make and break down chitin. Arthropods are chitin, and so the fungus already has the molecular machinery, if you like, to eat its way through the chitin exoskeleton of something like a spider. So once it's inside, it grows, it eats the insides, it consumes it, kills its host eventually, and then the fungus bursts out and you get these white coral-like growths of fungus, spores over tens of meters and infect other spiders. That's the nice version of what happens. The not so nice version usually happens if you're an ant. These are a very diverse group of fungi. There are probably about 600 to 700 species that we know about. There are probably hundreds more we don't know about. And I think we discovered some new ones on fieldwork a couple of months ago. So if you're an ant and you're a leaf cutter ant, you live in a huge colony, you farm fungus using leaves as a substrate and you eat the fungus. If you're a leafcutter ant and you happen to be out and about and the spore from this particular fungus here lands on your exoskeleton, you've got about 4 weeks left of life, and it's not a fun 4 weeks. So the first thing it does, the fungus bores its way inside its little ant host, and we're not entirely sure how it does it, but it manipulates the behavior of the ant. So the first thing that happens is the ant starts to behave oddly, and it leaves its nest, and it's driven to climb up something. So it'll climb up a leaf or a tree to a greater height. What also, as this is happening, the fungus has grown into the jaw muscles of the ant. So the fungal tissue is inside the jaw muscles, and it can stimulate the jaw muscles, so it can trigger the ant to bite onto something, and it makes it hypercontract. The ant can't let go. So when you find these ants are usually hanging on to a leaf or a twig, and they're still hanging on even though they're dead. So at this point, the ant is alive, it's climbed up a leaf, it's now biting onto this leaf and can't let go. And this is the point when the fungus continues to grow and can eat the rest of its insides before it eventually kills the ant. And in this case, it bursts out of the ant's head to produce this fruiting body over the course of about 10 days to 2 weeks, and spread more spores. If you can get your host to climb several meters up a tree, your spores are going to disperse over a much greater area, which is a really good evolutionary advantage because you go on to infect more and more ants. And we're finding that they're really, really closely associated. So each species of Ophiocordyceps only infects a single species of ant. And they infect all sorts of other insects. So dragonflies, grasshoppers, beetles, wasps, you name it, they will infect them. And they're amazing, they're really, really cool. And because they've evolved this ability to invade and control the bodies of an animal, they're a high research area for potential pharmaceuticals. You and I are not very closely related to ants, we're quite different. But at the very basic biological, biochemical level, we do have things in common, which is why that we think a lot of the chemicals produced by these fungi for us. And we will use those as pharmaceutical drugs. Which brings me on to the humans and fungi. I'm going to talk about drugs, pharmaceutical drugs in a moment. I'll talk about drugs in about 5 minutes. So those are the ecological roles that fungi play out there in the world. And because they're really good at breaking things down, organic matter, eating complex organic polymers like cellulose and lignin, which is wood, because they're good at killing competitors out there in the environment because they have to get the food they want, we make use of a lot of those chemicals and enzymes for ourselves. So there's about 170, I think it is, 170, 180 industrial enzymes that we use in making things like washing powders. So biological washing powder uses fungal enzymes. Paper manufacturing, cotton processing, leather processing, biofuels, all of these things we use fungal enzymes as part of. If you're wearing anything made of cotton or leather, they've used fungal enzymes as part of the processing to make those fabrics. We can use fungal enzymes to break down agricultural waste to make things like bioethanol as a fuel. We can use fungi also as actual biological factories to make things that we want. There's two groups of fungi that we use this a lot for, things called aspergillus. It's a filamentous fungus. Some types of aspergillus you get in damp homes, and they're very bad for you. We don't use that one, thankfully. But you can take genes from a different organism that makes a compound or an enzyme that you want, and you can stick it in aspergillus, ferment it in a huge tank, and it will make that compound for you, like a little biological factory. The best example of that is citric acid. Most things that you eat, if it contains citric acid, apart from lemons and fruit, that citric acid hasn't come from a lemon, it's come from a fungus that now is used to make citric acid. This was the ability to be able to do this biotechnology engineering came about, I think it was in the 50s or 60s. It revolutionized the way that we're able to make some of these compounds. And actually Aspergillus, in being able to do this, took down the mafia in Sicily. Before we could do this, the only place to get citric acid was lemons, and the best place for that was Sicily and the lemon groves, which were all controlled by the mafia. The moment that we were able to do this biotechnology and ferment it without the needs for Sicilian lemons, all the power and influence and money that the mafia had coming in completely gone. So a fungus took down the mafia. There's probably a book or a film in there somewhere. We obviously use fungi for food. I'm going to talk about food in a minute. We use fungi as those biological factories to make things we want. Things like vitamins. Most vitamins that you get in vitamin tablets don't come from a plant or something. They're made using a fungus. We use fungi to make vitamin C, to make vitamin B in vast fermentation tanks, and then we sort of filter it out, stick it in a tablet, and send it out to shops. We use fungi in all sorts of different ways, and people have been using fungi in all sorts of different ways, probably as long as there have been people. We don't have any evidence of that. 30, 40,000 years ago, we were probably eating mushrooms. We don't have any evidence of it then, but what we do know is that humans, for certain, have been eating mushrooms for at least a few thousand years. In the West, we're really boring. We only eat about 4 different species of mushroom. If you go to the supermarket, you'll see things like button mushroom, chestnuts, portobellos, closed cap, all of these whitish brown things. They're all the same species. It's very, very boring. We also eat in the West oyster mushrooms and sometimes things like shiitakes. We're really, really dull. To China particularly, they eat and farm about 400 or 500 different species of mushroom. They have a much broader range of things that they eat, and it'd be really good if we started to do some of that as well. And not only do we eat mushrooms, we eat fungal products. So probably 3 of the major food groups come from fungus: beer, wine, and bread. All of these involve yeasts, and yeasts are a single-celled fungus. And other things like fermented products, particularly in the Far East, like soya, you have soy sauce, tempeh, the little thing like fermented, all of those use fungus as a means to turn a perishable product into something that you can use and actually can be more nutritious than the original pre-fermented product. So we know that we've been eating mushrooms for thousands of years. In some cases, not necessarily nutritious. It's not nutrition that we're interested in. We actually want different things that the fungi can do for us, which brings us on to magic mushrooms. Now, because I'm kind of representing Kew here, and we are a scientific institution, which is a government body, I have to say that eating magic mushrooms is illegal. They are a Schedule 1 drug in this country. The collecting, picking, selling, processing, and eating of them is illegal. Now, humans have been eating magic mushrooms for about 5,000 to 6,000 years that we know of. This weird-looking chap in the middle photo, it's a reconstruction of the image on the far right, which is a cave painting from Algeria and dates to about 7,000 years ago. And this is a humanoid figure which has mushrooms growing all over him and handfuls of what probably look like psilocybe fungi. And the reason that this was painted on a cave wall and has lasted 4,000 years is because these psilocybe fungi were culturally important to these people. If you go to Central America, they used to carve, they probably still do, carve statues of humanoid figures with psilocybe fungi growing out of their heads. There's about 170 species of psilocybe fungus all over the world that produce hallucinogens, and everywhere we find them, people have been eating them. Probably for religious purposes, cultural purposes, but also probably entirely recreational. Humans like eating and doing strange things. That's why we all drink alcohol, for instance. So humans have been eating these fungi because they're hallucinogenic for a long time. There was an idea going around, I don't think it's very well received, called the stoned ape hypothesis, which says that basically when humans, our earliest ancestors, came out of trees and started to live on the grasslands in eastern Africa, they would have come across some of these fungi growing on the dung of the grazing animals there. And they think that we actually started eating them then, and the effects of having these things helped us to think and our brains to grow and develop in different ways. It's probably nonsense, but it's a good story. Now, this, so these have been eaten for thousands of years. They're now illegal in this country. You're not supposed to eat them. Go to other countries and it's much more different. I think I was talking earlier that in Jamaica, for instance, there's no laws regarding magic mushrooms. So it's a good place to do studies and to research these fungi. And there is a lot of research being done on these fungi at the moment because the hallucinogenic compounds are probably as close as we're going to get to a wonder drug when it comes to certain mental health conditions. So there was a study done, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago now, in Imperial College by a chap called Professor David Nutt. So he used to be the government's chief advisor on drugs policy until he produced a report saying we should probably think about legalizing certain drugs like ecstasy, cannabis, and magic mushrooms because they're not that dangerous, and if we regulate it, we can actually do much better. The government didn't like it, so they sacked him. He went to Imperial College and he set up a research group studying psychoactive plants and compounds and how they could be used therapeutically. And what they found was that these magic mushrooms, if somebody has severe depression that doesn't respond well to conventional antidepressants, if you send them on one trip using psilocybe, they can be effectively cured for 2 to 3 weeks, and in some cases for several months off a single trip. And what they discovered was that depression and severe depression isn't an absence of something in the brain, it's an active state of one part of the brain. And that part of the brain won't switch off, and that's what seems to cause depression. They found that if you give someone psilocybin, it switches that part of the brain off, in addition to hallucinations and all of those sorts of things. And they've repeated this study over in America a few times. They've done toxicology studies here in the UK as well, and they found this is amazing. This is potentially amazing. It would also work for things like PTSD or sort of pathological OCD as well. These fungi are non-toxic. You physically can't eat enough of them to get a toxic dose of some of the compounds involved. You'd have to eat 17 kilos of the mushroom. And I don't think you've got enough body space between either end of our tube to fit that much fungus. They're super safe. The other good thing is they're non-addictive. They're not inherently addictive in the same way that things like opiates are. So these could potentially revolutionize a lot of the way that we deal with some mental health conditions in this country, or around the world, in fact. And they're really easy to grow. They will grow on waste material. You can feed them compost or wood chip. These grow in really large numbers in Kew Gardens on some of the wood chip. Ironically, around one of the children's play areas. So these are something we can cultivate very, very easily. And people have been cultivating these for illicit purposes for a long time. You can get kits to grow them in Amsterdam, for instance, I'm told. So this is potentially a really, really interesting and novel way that we can treat some of the things like mental health and neurological problems are really hard to do and to study because you're dealing with human beings, and human experimentation is a very unethical thing to do. So something that is a natural, non-toxic, non-addictive product, it seems to work in near miraculous ways, is potentially staggeringly useful. And I would not be surprised if over the next few years you find this starting to be used. I know a couple of people who do this illicitly to treat mental health, and it's apparently amazing at a micro dosing, so they're not weekly off with the fairies, as it were. The non-illegal drugs, we're going to go on to now as well. So I always, whenever I'm doing talks and have tours in the Fungarium, I always ask this question. If you don't want to answer, of course, please. Has anybody here had an organ transplant? No? No one ever does. It's really boring. So some of our most important and, if you like, radical drugs that we have and have changed modern medicine and human lives in lots of different ways come from fungi. The obvious one that everyone knows about, antibiotics, so penicillin, discovered by accident in the 1920s by Alexander Fleming, is a compound that is antibacterial. This is something that has changed the way that modern medicine works, and it's made surgery a completely different place to operate, literally and figuratively. And that's the one that everyone knows about. But if you've had an organ transplant, the drugs that you have to take in order to stop your body rejecting that fungus, rejecting that new organ, those immunosuppressants come from a fungus. They come from one of those zombie fungi I showed you earlier. They come from a type of a fungus called Isaria sinclairi. Sorry, no, they don't. They come from something called Tolyplacadium, which is an insect pathogen fungus. Isaria sinclairi is another entomopathogen which parasitizes cicadas, invades them, controls them, eats their guts out, and then bursts out of their head. It's also the source of the main drug that we use to treat multiple sclerosis. So the drug that we use for MS these days, one of the widest used drugs, is a thing called fingolimod, and that was derived from Isaria sinclairi, which is one of these cordyceps type fungus. There's another drug that's being developed that comes from a zombie fungus, one of these cordyceps type things that invade insects, called cordycepin, which is being tested because it has anti-cancer properties. And there are three things there, three drugs there that all come from these insect and parasitizing and invading and mind-controlling fungi. And there's a huge amount of research being done on them because they seem to have all these really novel and unusual biological effects. There's another big group of drugs which are quite important these days, statins. Probably everyone's heard of statins. They're heart disease. Statins come from fungi. Originally, they're produced by fungi to kill other fungi. They're actually an antifungal compound. Fungi out there in the world produce statins to interfere with the way that other fungi out there that they're competing against make and produce various steroids. They need those as part of their standard metabolism. So if you can stop your competitors from making steroids, they eventually die because they can't metabolize properly. So cholesterol is a type of steroid. If we take statins at the right sort of dose, it stops our body producing cholesterol, which lowers our blood pressure and is good for your heart. So we use these antifungal compounds and things in all sorts of different ways for our own health, for the clothes that we wear, for the food that we eat. And there is potential that into the future they will become increasingly more important. So I have done another talk in the past which talks about the ways that we can use fungi to revolutionize and solve some of the world's problems. I call the talk, Let's Get Rid of Cows. Because everything that cows give us, we can get from fungi. We can make leather using fungus. You can grow fungi, then it will produce a vegan leather with a minuscule compared to the amount of resources and space that's needed to produce a cow's worth of leather. We can use fungi to make protein alternatives. Corn isn't the most exciting of foodstuffs, but it is high in protein, and it's a good replacement for meats. The third thing, and probably the most important for me, is cheese or dairy products. Cows are a really good source of dairy. They're probably our only real source of dairy. You can actually make cow's milk using a fungus. That biotechnology I talked about earlier, there's a company that has done it now. You can take the genes from a cow to make the milk proteins. You put it in a fungus and ferment it, one of those aspergilluses. That fungus will then produce cow's milk. All you have to do is add a little bit of fat if you want it to be non-skim milk. And it is, for all intents and purposes, cow's milk produced in a colossal vat using a fungus without the need for the feed, the water, and the land to produce exactly the same process. So meat, leather, and milk, everything that we want from a cow without the need. From a practical point of view, this would be amazing. We're never going to do it because people don't change. But from an ecological point of view, it would totally change our planet. At the moment, about a third of all the space that's used, all of the land on Earth goes towards livestock agriculture. A third of all of the fresh water we use as a species goes towards livestock agriculture. The biggest drivers of habitat loss are from livestock agriculture, and about 15% of all our greenhouse gas emissions come from cows and other livestock. So if we eliminated just the cow part of that livestock agriculture, it would be a huge improvement in our global environment. And fungi would enable us to do that. As well as the potential pharmaceuticals I mentioned that we're going to get from other types of fungi, we can also get different materials from them. So I mentioned the leather that we can farm in vast quantities, really cheaply, really easily, low resource as well. You can grow these fungal leathers using agricultural waste, so like wood chip or corn husks, all those sorts of things. So it's a really good alternative to cows, and there's a number of companies now making this myco leather. You can also grow things with fungi. You can make these square panel things here. These are kind of a pilot idea. You can make insulation boards for houses using waste sawdust and fungus. You can inoculate a mold containing sawdust and wood chip with something like an oyster mushroom. It will grow throughout it all. Once it's fully colonized you bake it to dry it and kill the fungus, and you can use it for sound and heat insulation. You can grow furniture using fungus, again using oyster mushrooms. The fungus will occupy any space you give it. So if you control the shape and the size of what you want this fungus to do, you can make anything. And there's a company that makes a replacement for styrofoam. They use oyster mushrooms and sawdust. And they basically, it's as strong as styrofoam. It has all the same impact reducing properties. So you can package things like furniture or glassware or anything you would normally find styrofoam protecting. You can use one of these mycofoams to do exactly the same job, but it's entirely biodegradable. So if you were to have a new TV delivered with mycofoam around the corners, you could take that foam type stuff and you could throw it in the garden and it would compost. You wouldn't have to dispose of that white styrofoam stuff. There are these panel things are a great thing. NASA are seriously looking at using because you can grow these fungi and they produce these structures and they're strong and durable using waste material. The idea is if we're going to start to colonize things like Mars or Moon, we're going to produce a lot of waste. Some of it plant waste, as we do farming and food production. Alternatively, humans produce their own waste. We can actually turn all of that into bricks using a fungus called Fomes fomentarius. It's one of those hoof fungus. It's a bracket fungus. I think I showed Fomes at the beginning on a tree growing. So this is a strong, durable brick that you can grow yourself using waste material, minimal input. It's really easy, and they're looking at whether we could do this to grow structures and to grow buildings ourselves as we go and colonize other planets. Or they're looking at whether we can use these to quickly mass-produce buildings. If we use these fungal panels or these fungal bricks to produce buildings or shelters for people if it's a natural disaster. So the potential is that we can do an awful lot with fungi, not just at the chemical level or the food level, but at the sort of the macro level, the buildings that we use, the materials that we clothe ourselves with, and all of which would help to stop things like plastics being produced and the waste that we produce. There's also a huge sphere of fungal science called bioremediation. So fungi can eat toxic compounds. Fungi can eat, oyster mushrooms, again, oyster mushrooms are amazing. They taste, can eat crude oil. They can break down the long chain hydrocarbons and make them and neutralize them. And you can use fungi to clean up contaminated soils. They will absorb radioisotopes. So you can clean up contaminated lands using fungi. You can clean polluted rivers using fungi. The best thing out there in the world already, and there's the potential they become even more important, even more useful for everything that we might want to do. There we go, right. Whiz through. I hadn't realized I'd gone well over 45 minutes, but...
Now I realized why we didn't need the quantity as well as the quality. Thank you very much for that tremendous run-through in the whole field of fungi.
Thank you very much.
And the various ways that they can be used. I'm sure you've picked the audience brains to come up with lots and lots of questions. If you can please raise your hands, I have the portable mic, I'll bring it round, and Lee will do his best to deal promptly with your problem. Paul.
Just a very simple question. How hardy are they? Do they need particular conditions to survive in?
Yes and no. They don't like it dry, so they like it if they're damp. So the best time to find fungi in this country is in autumn, when it's still slightly warm, but it's also starting to get wetter. So things like oyster mushrooms, you can grow them very easily at home without any kind of, just in sort of house temperatures, as long as you keep them damp. So most fungi, as long as there's damp and it's kind of maybe room temperature to like, low 20s, you can grow most things at those sorts of temperatures. Allegedly, if you're growing magic mushrooms from a kit, you need it to be 23 degrees. I don't know, that's a bad example, but it's one example of something I know you can cultivate. They're really easy to grow. They don't need it to be too hot, for instance. A lot of the ones that we'd be interested in, you can do at kind of low central heating temperatures, as long as there's moisture.
Next, Jen.
Thank you so much. That was a really, really stimulating. Are you also given the opportunity to stimulate people out in the business world? Is this being followed through commercially?
Yes, I think certainly there are there's a lot of companies, I think, so there are few companies doing it. So there's the two companies that make the leather, for instance, and the styrofoam replacement. I'm assuming they've got patents. So I'm assuming how they get their fungal leather or their foam to do its thing is patented. There are multiple companies trying to do this. Those two, the main company is called Ecovative. I know that they're building an enormous factory to scale up their production. The other company is called Mycology, which make the leather. I really don't like them. He doesn't want to make a product that's available for everyone. He wants to have partnerships with designers, so like a very exclusive, high-end, rich stuff. This Ecovative we're building an enormous factory. We're going to make packaging for IKEA. We're going to make vast amounts of leather. So there is some scaling up of what's existing already. There's a lot of interest in businesses to produce non-animal alternatives to things like leathers. There are companies that make it out of pineapple rinds. So when you peel a pineapple in the tropics where they farm pineapples and all our Del Monte pineapple tin stuff comes, all of the waste products, apparently you can process it to make a leathery type replacement. So there's lots of interest and small startups of this happening for the materials. The drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs, that's a huge area. I mean, it has been probably since Alexander Fleming found penicillin. There's lots of research, lots of studies going on looking at different compounds they're producing. There are the enzymes to produce, for washing powders or to make animal feed nutritious, all of those things. Again, there's a huge industrial apparatus out there to explore. I met a lady a couple of years ago who works for a big industrial chemical company. She literally just goes around the world looking for new fungi and bringing them back and just seeing what enzymes are in there and what they could use them for. Because these are all small things that form the components of something else bigger, we only ever see the end product. So, we always see the new washing powder. We don't know about the newly discovered enzyme that's included in it. A bit like fungi, they aren't always visible, but they're doing all the hard work. So they're a massive growth area in all sorts of different things. Basically, all of those red squares that I put up, there's lots of research going on to all new types of fungi that we can grow and farm easily that people want to taste nice. There's lots of stuff going on to produce new fungal products, fungal enzymes, fungal compounds for everything that we in our lives. So yes, it's ongoing constantly, thankfully.
That's encouragingly. Is Kew actively participating in these industrial aspects?
Slightly. So Kew's, so the research that we do at Kew is the foundational level. Like I said, we probably only know about 5% of the world's fungi scientifically. So most of what we do is that foundational level. What fungi are out there? How are they related to one another? And where are they? So the basis of all further fungal science relies on discovering these things. So we go out and we do field work all over the world. I get to go to lovely places. We bring specimens back. there are companies who are interested in using our collection to find novel compounds. So be careful how we do this because our collection is very international. There are legal things in place to stop the exploitation of natural resources from one company or another, so one country or another. So we have to be careful how you tread the ground in terms of if we have a fungus from Madagascar that has a wonderful chemical in it, you can't just go and commercialize it and make billions. You have to, some of those billions have to get back to Madagascar, as it were. So we're involved in the beginnings of that process, finding these fungi, and we do have now, there's a commercial innovation unit, which is fairly newish, which is looking at, I think we have a company who's interested in pigments, so dyes to use in clothes, because apparently black is a really difficult dye to make. It's usually just a very dark blue or a dark red. So fungi do have black pigments, so they're interested in the pigments they can get from fungi to make novel clothes dyes, for instance. So we do have a little bit, but the primary focus of everything we do is discovery, if you like. Discovery and taxonomy and what's out there.
Thank you. Ella?
Yeah, in terms of like the fungal pathogen thing, like the cordyceps, are there any of those found in mammals? Like, and could there potentially be like crossover or something if like climate warms or something?
Well, this has become a big topic at the moment because there's been a TV series about a zombie apocalypse caused against humans using one of these cordyceps type fungus. I'm going to say no, but also maybe. So at the moment, they can't infect mammals. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is we're too hot. Mammals, our body temperature is 30s. I can't remember what human body temperature is. Is it 35 Celsius, something like that? 37, okay, there we go, 37. If I'm remembering right, above about 30, 34 degrees, they go inert. We're too hot. We have quite a complex immune system that's able to fight them off. And also, they've evolved over tens of millions of years. We know they've been around for about 60 million years. They've evolved to be very targeted, focused on their little insect hosts. So we're fairly safe. So no at the moment. But yes, what you said about climate change is a factor. We know that the climate's getting warmer. And there have been a couple of outbreaks while COVID was going around in immunocompromised people who were getting really nasty fungal infections, not cordyceps, thankfully, other kinds of fungi, which looks like it's possibly being driven by a warming climate pushing the evolution of fungi to tolerate warmer and warmer environments. Now that will also apply to cordyceps type fungi. So it is possible they will be able to tolerate mammal body temperatures in the future. There is one report of a mammal infected by a cordyceps type fungus. It wasn't published about because it was in 2020. It was in the middle of 2020, which is when COVID was going on. The reason it wasn't released is because it was an infected bat found in China. So they thought, not quite the right time to do this, but it was a bat that was hibernating. So when mammals hibernate, their body temperature drops quite a lot. So its body temperature was within what a cordyceps can tolerate. Hence the maybe. We know that they can get into, and certainly this one individual bat was infected and killed by it. But generally speaking, probably no for the time being. Maybe in 30, 40 years, who knows? But, yeah.
That's a slightly different question. Invasive species, so for both plants and animals, we have examples where I guess our global transport chains have led to problems of species going, into different eco-niches. I just wondered whether that, in principle, could apply to fungi. Are there examples there are?
It does apply. So we don't know a huge amount about when it comes to, so invasive fungi is a bit of a niche within a niche. There are not many mycologists in the world. There's like 10 to 1 outnumbered by plant people. So we know that fungi are in countries where they don't come from. Organizations like Kew have accidentally brought things into this country that we are luckily not invasive. So the fungi that have made their way into Britain are normally just saprophytes. So they're probably not that bad. the spread of disease or pathogenic fungi, things like that are pathogenic on things like agricultural crops, so rust fungi, which can devastate wheat crops or things like that. Warming, wetter climate like we're going to have, we may find that they become more of a problem because they will be able to spread further and do better. There are 2 instances of potentially invasive fungi in the sense that we normally think of, like an animal getting into another country and being bad for the local wildlife. One of them is caused by humans moving mycorrhizal fungi around the world. So because we know that trees need to have mycorrhizal fungi, we will produce mycorrhizal fungal spawn to inoculate. They produce those in big places in Europe and then sell them and use them on trees that are being grown in plantations in the global south. So Colombia, for instance. We've done fieldwork in Colombia. We found European fungi in Colombia on plantation trees of these pine plantations. We've also found them on native oak trees in Colombia. So these fungi have left the intended original hosts, and they are now partnering up with native endemic oak trees. And it's possible they are pushing out the natural native local Colombian mycorrhizal fungi. There's a problem in North America with deathcap fungi. Same sort of thing. They've been introduced into North America where they don't normally occur, and they're spreading. They are forming symbiotic partnerships with American trees and potentially pushing out mycorrhizal fungi from North America. So it's fungi are understudied anyway. So the invasive conservation, ecological aspects are even less study is done on those. There's 2, so yeah, the death cap and the Amanita muscaria are the 2 that I know of. And the death caps are doing something weird as well. I'm totally on a tangent, I'm sorry, but it's really cool. So fungi, fungal sex is really strange. It's really, really odd. So in the case of death caps, these super toxic amanitas, Amanita phalloides, they normally need to actually have sex. So the spores from 2 different individuals need to meet when they're germinating fungus. Because these death caps have been introduced into North America, and they're not very numerous, so it's quite hard for them to encounter the spores from another individual. So they've somehow evolved the ability to become effectively self-fertile. So 2 spores from a single death cap mushroom can actually now mate and have sex. And it's a totally new innovation that they've evolved, which is a big problem because it means they're going to spread a lot more. Yeah, fungal sex is so strange.
You described a fungus that will digest plastics, and we are told that the oceans are being consumed and ruined by plastics, and yet nobody seems to be using these fungi that you're talking about. Is it because there's an inherent prejudice against fungi?
Not necessarily inherent prejudice. It's that we only discovered this fungus exists in 2018. So this was a thing called Aspergillus terreus that was found on waste plastic in a garbage dump in Pakistan in 2018. There's lots of research being done on fungi that could potentially eat plastics. So I think the one that was found in 2018, what they discovered, it's not eating the plastic. All it does is it breaks the plastic down, so it makes it degrade faster, which isn't necessarily a good thing, because all it means is you turn a plastic milk tub into lots of small microplastics, which are actually probably worse. But there are fungi that can literally break down the large, complex polymer molecules that make up plastics. So it looks like maybe what we can do is, if we take the oceans, we can take all the plastics out of the ocean, first of all, because you need to have them on land, because fungi can't live in the sea. If you collect all the plastics, you could put them through something like industrial liquidizer or food processor to break them down, and then inoculate them with these various fungi that can break them down into smaller bits and start to break the plastics, and you could, in theory, eat and digest these waste plastics that we produce. But the research has been going on for like 5 years, 2 of which have been over COVID. I actually have a colleague who works at Kew. She's one of the senior research leaders. This is the sort of stuff she studies. She's exploring and looking for fungi that live on plastics. So she goes to beaches looking for plastic crap that's washed up and looks at the fungi that are living on them to find ones that could potentially be eating the plastic. So it's like, yeah, just starting in the same way antibiotics start in the 20s and where we are now. It's just a new thing.
So.
It's a small point, really. The Chinese, I think, eat a great deal of fungi of one kind or another. It's just like the rare earth business that the Chinese own all the good stuff, and somehow they're going to be the fungi leaders of the world, or do we all, the rest of us, have a chance?
We have a chance. I think it's just they're more adventurous with their food. They'll eat. They will eat. There are very, well, okay, that's not true. There are not that many super poisonous fungi. The number of toxic, as in toxic and kill you, species of fungi out there is probably a couple of hundred out of 144,000 that we know at the moment. So you can eat most fungi. Some of them are delicious. Some of them don't have much flavour at all. So they just, for whatever reason, they were just more adventurous at trying different things. They've incorporated it into their food culture. They're what we'd call a mycophilic culture. In Britain, we're very mycophobic. In Europe, you can almost draw a line across Europe, and north of that line, we are mycophobic. South of it, they're mycophilic. So if you go to like Central and Eastern Europe, they have a long cultural tradition that is usually parent to grandparent, grandparent to grandchild. They will go out, they will forage, they will collect, they know what to collect. They will collect lots of different species they can eat. We don't do that in this country. We generally think of fungi as either associated with the devil, fairies, or witchcraft. So we have a long cultural tradition of staying away from them. So it's purely a case that in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, actually in parts of Africa and South America, they eat different things to us, and they will eat things that we would not normally. That first slide at the mushroom, it looked like a big penis. The dead is called phallus. They farm that and they eat it, for instance. So it's purely a cultural thing where they eat mushrooms, stay away. But they're a good place to go if you want to look for new potential things, because they know how to farm them.
Last question. Jenny.
Thank you. On a very parochial note, we have had to cut down, to our great sorrow, a couple of large trees because they had bracket fungus, and we were told that it was very unsafe to leave them. If it comes up with some other trees, would we be justified in saying, no, it's quite a good thing to have bracket fungus?
It depends on what kind of bracket fungus it is.
Oh, I see.
There are a couple which are aggressive and will eat the tree and it will come down. But there are ones, so the one I showed, let me think, would that be right? I'm just thinking before I say something whether it's true or not. If the bracket that it produces, if you tap on it and it's hard and quite enameloid, those are generally okay to leave. If it's softer and it rots every year and it doesn't last, those can sometimes be problematic, but not all of them. So there's the really easy one to identify, this thing called chicken of the woods. It's bright yellow. That's a soft, squishy one that will rot every year. That's not such a bad thing on a tree. I mean, at Kew we have trees which have bracket fungi on them. They're 100 years old. They're still going. I know I've had people emailing saying, oh, my local council are cutting down the trees outside our house because they've got this bracket on them. And it's like, you don't need to cut it down. Unless the branches start coming off, it's probably okay, because these oak trees that live to be 1,000 years old have got these bracket fungi inside them, and they're only 100,000 years old because of the bracket. So if you can work out, if you know what one it is, it's probably okay, to be honest. I think a lot of local authorities tend to err on the side of caution, and yeah.
One last question.
I was just interested to know a little bit more about NASA's use of fungi, for food, and what they're doing on these, stations up in the,
So,
because they must be using something
I don't know if they use.
I don't know how they eat or what.
Potentially you could farm. I mean, they could potentially farm fungi for food as well. I think they just send them up with lunch boxes, like freeze-dried packaged stuff for food. The growing the bricks, the fungal bricks. I think they haven't done it yet because we haven't gone to Mars. But it's one of. I think it's one of those things. It's like it's a potential way of, if you have to build on Mars, you have two options. You can take things there, which is expensive and takes time and lots of fuel, or you can take something you can grow and do yourself when you get there. And fungi are an opportunity to do that. You can take a culture of some type of a fungus and it will last, and you can do that in a laboratory, a small laboratory. I think so. That's what they're interested in. Is this a viable option? Because I mean, you can make, if you pack all the waste plant material that you farm, if you have some kind of hydroponic system, and you put your own human waste into it as well and inoculate it, you can make a brick and then you bake it, and it's as strong as, you know, it's strong enough that you can build something large. It's got a degree of flexibility, so they are potentially a really good building material. So they are doing research into whether this. I don't know much else about them, but it's
If
NASA.
you start taking the waste up there, you'll also have other organisms start.
Yeah, I think they'll do that when they get to the other side, if they get there. But it would make sense to farm these things in space as well, because you'll have to set up some kind of farming system, and fungi are the best one because you don't need to have windows to let the light in, because they don't need the light.
Thank you.
I hope you come back to us for next year's program when we have talks about the Mars mission and how it's going to transpire. Lee, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you too will come back to us at some time in the future, because clearly this is such a huge field and such an expanding and modern field. There are bound to be changes in it, and we would certainly appreciate another talk from you. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you very much for inviting me.
As I explained to the last questioner, we're putting together a program which I hope you'll find interesting for next year. If you have any particular ideas or particular speakers you would like us to invite, please talk to me or to one of the members of the Science Committee, and we'll do our best to oblige. Wonderful.
Thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful.